Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones alongside editor Michael Woodson. Today we are talking with novelist Rob Hart about his most recent book, The Paradox Hotel, which is also featured in the September-October 2023 issue of the magazine. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we get started, could you briefly describe the premise of The Paradox Hotel for listeners who haven't read it yet?
Sure. So The Paradox Hotel is set in a hotel for time travelers, and it's about the house detective, whose name is January, who at the start of the book is dealing with a whole bunch of problems, but the biggest one being that there are all these billionaires who are coming in and bidding for the rights to take over both the hotel and the accompanying time port, which would basically privatize time travel. And as if this isn't a problem enough, she finds a dead body that no one else can see. So she's not exactly sure if this is a murder that will happen or might happen or what. So she suddenly finds herself in this position of trying to solve this impossible murder at the same time that all these billionaires are trying to come in and basically wreck reality.
Yeah, that sounds fairly terrifying. So I heard you talk a little bit about this at the Writer's Digest conference, but could you tell us a little bit about how you came up with this idea and how you pitched it to your agent and editor?
Sure. I don't know if either of you have been to Sleep No More.
Mm-mm.
Okay, highly recommended. It's a interactive theater show. It's in Manhattan, in Chelsea, and it's like a retelling of Macbeth, but it starts in a hotel and then it sort of spreads out to where it's on like multiple floors of this warehouse, and you'll be in like a psych ward and go through a door and be in a cemetery and then go through another door and be like, in the forest. And all the audience members wear masks, and you're watching the actors performing it live, but you can follow different actors, you can follow different scenarios, you can go into rooms and start rifling through drawers. It is wild. I've done it like four or five times. And one of the times I was doing it, I was just walking from one room to another, and I was like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a hotel where you can walk into a room and it was like 5 minutes from now or 10 minutes ago? And I was like, oh, cool, time travel hotel. So I have this system for myself where whenever I get an idea, I start a Google Doc and I throw it in there. And some of them work out, some of them don't. Some of them are nonsense, and I look back at them and wonder what I was thinking. But with this one, it just kept on scratching at me, and I was like, I really think this would be fun, and I've always wanted to do a time travel book. And I pitched it to my agent, and I was like, yeah, I've got this great idea. It's going to be a time travel book. It's going to be, but there's no real time travel. It's set in a hotel for time travelers, and there's going to be robots and dinosaurs, but it's also going to be about like grief and, how hard it is to face yourself and moving on from trauma. And he was like, that sounds insane. Don't write that. And I was like, okay, you're the boss. And I started working on another pitch for like 6 months that went nowhere. And finally, I called him up and I stamped my feet and I cried. And I was like, I need to write the time travel book. This is the book that's in me. This is the one I want to do. And he was like, okay, fine. Okay, fine. And my editor was also sort of on the fence, but was open to the idea. And I remember when I finished the draft of the book, maybe like 8 months later, and I sent it to my agent and he read it. I was at the playground with my daughter, and she's like running around, and I'm just kind of like standing off to the side, and I get a phone call and he's like, all right, you pulled off the dinosaurs. I'm like, yeah, I did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it was, it's one of those things, and that's the difficulty sometimes with this process is you see it in your head and you're like, I get this, I know this, but it's hard to explain in, just sitting someone down and telling it to them, or even in like a couple of pages in a written pitch.
Right.
And so you find yourself in this place of having this whole world inside you and being like, I get it. Like, how do I make someone else get it? And yeah, the trick is to throw a tantrum.
That someone else said something similar. I can't remember who at the conference, that maybe it was one of the keynotes, was saying they felt compelled to, there was a story in them that they knew they wanted to write. and their editor and agent was like, "Don't." And then it just
Mhm.
kept coming back to them, and then ultimately it was like they just had to prove that they could, what was in their head was something that other people could um, digest and understand as well. That's interesting. I think it's good
Mhm.
advice.
It's you know, it goes back to the one thing that I keep on telling people lately is that if you want to make it, you got to be stubborn. That's the best
Yeah.
thing you can do is just be really, really stubborn.
You mentioned dinosaurs, and something that I don't think can be ignored is the pacing, which is like totally relentless in this book. I ran into at the conference. I told you this book like blew my mind, and
Oh, thank you.
I was like breathless after certain scenes. And without giving too much spoilers, like the dinosaur scene is a great example of that. So my question is, what is your advice for other writers who want to maintain a certain like pulse pounding pace without overwhelming readers? Because there were still a lot of moments of introspection in this book that are also crucial to the story, but the pace was never compromised.
That's one of those things that and I'm always interested in the idea of taking the writing process and trying to put
Yeah.
some science in the art and break it down in a way that is going to make it easy to digest. But when it comes to pacing, sometimes it's one of those things like, when you see it. Like, I know that when I start to get bored or when I start to flag, then it's like, okay, we got to pick up the pace a little bit. We got to do something here that's going to be fun and interesting. I know that if I linger on a scene for too long, then I might lose the interest of a reader. And it's like, okay, we have to start moving things right now. And it's also kind of knowing that as important as those introspective scenes are, you have to have them because you need to have breaths for the characters, is you also don't want them to spend the entire book doing that,
Right.
and it's this mix of trying to have my cake and eat it too. Like I said,
Yeah.
earlier, it was like it's a book about grief, it's a book about moving on, but it's also going to be a fun book because if this
Mhm.
is like my time travel book, like I want to write my version of it. And so one of the things that I tell people a lot that I think a really good thing to do for pacing, and when I started thinking of it in these terms, it just really sort of like solidified a lot of things for me, is that kung fu movies and musicals are essentially the same. In that you get a bunch of people in a room, and as emotions start to rise, either someone sings or someone fights someone. But really, really good ones are sort of expertly paced in the sense that you kind of see that emotional rise, and then you see that sort of like climactic moment of the song or the fight, but then you kind of need a breath after that. Like you need to take a breath, you need to let everyone's nervous systems kind of like regulate, and then you find the opportunity to do it again. And when you look at it of like the dips and the waves of that, it gets a lot easier. And a really good song or a really good fight scene will tell a story. You can
Mhm.
still advance the story while you're doing these things. And once you kind of lock into this idea of like, okay, cool, like I'm going to have this scene with dinosaurs in it, but what is it saying? It's cool to have, and I'm excited, but what is this revealing about the characters and the way they interact, and what is it revealing about January? And
Right.
once you kind of find that rhythm, I think it gets a little bit easier. But finding the rhythm it's hard. It takes a lot of practice.
So one of the things that was interesting to me was how this book sort of blended genres a little bit. It's kind of part sci-fi, part mystery, crime, and I wondered what blending those genres allowed you to do with the story or to get away with in the story that sticking to one clear genre would have prohibited or
Mm.
made more challenging.
It lets you get away with a lot more, which has always been the thing that I loved about doing that, about combining genres, is that all of a sudden your toy box gets so much bigger. All of a sudden you've
Mhm.
got so
Hmm.
much more stuff to play with. And I knew that I wanted to sort of have both fantastical elements, but also make it feel kind of grounded, make it feel like,
Mhm.
okay, this is a whodunit. Like I'm gonna sort of adhere
Hmm.
to these rules that if you're really, really paying attention, you might be able to figure it out, or you might be able to guess who the bad guy is at the end. But at the same time, I wanted to sort of shove in all this other stuff. And again, like that comes from me just wanting to have the absolute best time possible.
Yeah.
What was funny is my next book, which is coming out in June. It's called Assassins Anonymous, and it's about basically like a John Wick level hitman who gets into a like a recovery program for killers. And it was weird, after the Warehouse and Paradox Hotel, like sort of leaving that cross genre spec sci-fi thing and going into
Mm.
just a contemporary thriller. And there were so many times my instinct was to push it further and do something weirder and start bringing like sci-fi elements into it. And I actually kind of relish that challenge of like, no, this is going to be grounded. Like this is something that can happen right now. And those limits can be fun sometimes because they push you to be a little bit more creative. They push you to work a little harder. But I'm not going to lie, I did kind of miss the ability to just do literally anything I wanted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of related to that, but it's also related to something that you mentioned at the beginning, where this is a time travel book with no time travel.
Yep.
And one of the things I wrote about the book in the November-December issue is that it felt like a variation on the locked room mystery trope,
Totally.
except this is sort
Exactly.
of like a lockdown hotel. Did you have that idea in mind when you were writing the book? And in that specific regard, what kind of freedoms or restrictions did that create?
I definitely wanted it to have a sort of locked room mystery feel. That going into that was key. And someone said this once, and I wish I could remember because I want to give them credit because it's so good. So I'm just going to say like this was not mine. But someone once said that any story that your character can walk away from, your reader can walk away from,
Mm.
which I think about a lot when I'm working. It's like you have to give people a reason to stay engaged because you have to have the character completely trapped in where they are. And so for January, it's kind of like a double whammy because she's in this hotel. It's a little remote. There's a blizzard going on outside. So little shining vibes there. But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, in the book, she's suffering from a neurological condition that
Hmm.
makes her kind of like slip around in time. And because of this, she can see her dead girlfriend. And because she can still maintain some level of connection there, she's afraid if she leaves, she's going to lose it. So she's got both this physical connection and this psychological connection. And I just loved this idea of setting it just in this one building, and not having moments of, she gets in a machine and she travels somewhere else. Like there's a flashback chapter to her on an assignment in
Right.
Berlin in like
Mm.
World War II. But yeah, I kind of, and again, like I like to set challenges for myself. It was like, can I write a time travel book where no one gets in a machine and goes somewhere? Can I just sort of, get away with doing this?
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt pretty good about it because sometimes you need those restrictions to sort of focus in on the characters and the setting. Because, I said before, like I love having the ability to kind of do whatever I want, but sometimes
Hmm.
if you can do that, you can very easily spin off the rails, like going down too many pathways where, if I'm stuck in this hotel with these characters, then that's where I'm going to be.
Wow. The way you just described that, also I hadn't considered like the elements of magical realism in this too, but some magical realism happening with Paradox Hotel as well. In you saying like this is a time travel story without time travel, a lot of magical realism, like the way it's described when you read it, it's not, you just can't be prepared for what you're about to read. And I think in that way it just made the book endlessly surprising. um and sort of related to all of this with the genre, something else, it feels like a blended emotional story as well. Like it's not just dramatic. There's a lot of really funny moments too. And January as a character is just really dry and sarcastic, and her internal monologue is very funny. But as the story progresses, we start to realize that in a lot of ways, her humor is just a defense mechanism. And that, as you said, she's not dealing with a lot of the trauma that she's
Mm-hmm.
experienced in the past, which feels kind of like a really slow reveal. Like you just think this is who she is, like a crabby, sarcastic, funny main character, and then you're just like, oh, she's compartmentalizing. She's not dealing.
Yep.
And my question is like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you balance the heart with the humor, and then also how do you start to incorporate that into revealing plot?
The balance can be hard. And actually, the first draft that my agent read, he was like, "You got to tone it down with January a little
Really?
bit. She's too much of a jerk,"
Oh.
Mm.
which was totally right and totally fair. And it was a very conscious choice to make her very acerbic and very
Mm,
sort of protective of herself because humor is a defense mechanism. It's
yeah.
the way that when we are struggling with the world around us or we're feeling like people aren't getting us, like we just like go, okay, we can make them laugh and that'll protect us. That'll give us a perceived value, and all of a sudden we'll be
Totally.
less of a target. And yeah, she's the queen of deflection.
Mm.
She's so good at it. And there's a part of me that's like that too. Like I tend to come from a place of leaning into humor too much when I need to be sort of leaning into vulnerability. And so that was the thing that I was trying to kind of question and unravel. And I also think humor is just generally a really important thing in fiction.
Yeah.
It's this way to sort of get your audience on your side, is to make them like your characters, to make them laugh and have a good time. And what I find is that it opens them up. And then the emotional moments at the end just like hit like body blows. And I think a contemporary master of that is James Gunn, who did the Guardians of the Galaxies movies, because those are just funny, silly, goofy movies where everyone is a clown, but they're all characters who are dealing with pain and deflecting that pain through humor. But by the time you get to the end, once those walls are broken down and you see those more human moments where they're actually connecting and sort of like working through those walls, it's like, oh my God, like it's just, you really feel it. And I really aspire to that. And again, it's one of those things that like finding the balance is hard. It took me my first draft and my agent telling me like, okay, you got to tone it down a little bit, and then going back in and saying like, okay, where is she being protective and where is she just being mean? Because and sometimes she's mean, sometimes she actively pushes people away because she's afraid of revealing things about herself,
and they
because
call
she's
her out
so
on that.
afraid. They do, which I think is important,
Yeah, totally.
and it's another thing about the book that I mean, I'm a sucker for a found family narrative,
Same.
and I loved that feeling of all of these people who like clearly loved her and clearly wanted the best for her, but also kind of seeing the way that they were breaking down and the way that they were getting tired of it and the way they were just not letting her get away with it anymore until she realized, oh my God, I really am alone now. Like I thought I was and I wasn't. And then I pushed everyone so far away that I kind of did this to myself. And then that's her realization moment of like, oh, it's okay to ask for help.
That whole, her story, that emotional story, I think was, I mean, I know it's a key part of the book, but it really was one of my favorite parts. Like seeing her growth journey. And I thought, ultimately, in a way, this is also a love story.
Absolutely.
And I really,
like, it's
really
funny. Like
that.
people keep on asking me like what genre it is, and for some reason in my head I always just go to romance. Like it's I think it's the most earnest thing I've ever written in those terms of of January's relationship with Mina, and that relationship, I loved it so much, and it was so much fun to write. It was just it was certainly something that provided some challenges because January is queer and Mina is a trans woman, and I had two fabulous authors, Alina Boyden and Emma Johnson, who are both trans, who both sat me down and kind of kept me in check and kept me in line. Alina very generously read the book and then sat me down afterward, and she's like, okay, like here's the stuff that you did good, here's the stuff that you messed up. And she was amazing in just sort of like barreling down to these great points that I go into it with an open heart and wanting to do the best job that I can, but I'm going to have blind spots. They happen, and it's why I'm always encouraging people to seek out beta readers and seek out sensitivity readers when they're not writing characters that are sort of their own viewpoint, because Mina's transness does end up becoming important to the plot. So, you want to go into that with as much respect as you can, but also humility and knowing that I don't want to mess this up. Like I want Alina to read this and say, okay, like I can see something here. And it was kind of a scary process. Again, it was one of those challenges I set for myself of like, can I do this in a way that is thoughtful and sensitive and kind of gets to the root of what I'm trying to talk about, which is again like a found family, and we're all in this together.
Okay, so we just talked about this being kind of a romance as well, but there's also this sort of like political element to it a little bit. That's one of the other things that I love about it. It poses this question of, what's more dangerous, time travel being controlled and restricted by the government versus being unregulated in the hands of the private business sector. And those kinds of stories are some of my favorites, but they can get heavy-handed sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So as you envisioned this worst case scenario for each, how did you make sure that what you included in the story served the story compared to just being something you wanted to include because it's of interest to you?
Well, yeah, it's definitely of interest to me. I'm incapable of writing a book at this point where the billionaires aren't the bad guys, because I
Right.
think billionaires are sort of inherently evil. But what I actually did early in the process of writing this book, which really helped, is I was trying to figure out, like, okay, what would it look like if time travel became a thing? And so I started thinking in terms of NASA and space travel, where space travel was sort of founded as a government pursuit, as, you know, something that was funded by governments, and now has slowly turned into a private industry. And it was like, okay, well, that tracks. Like, I could see that happening with time travel. So I dug a
Mm-hmm.
little bit further, and I was like, well, what happens to space travel? Like, why are they trying to privatize space travel? Because it can't just be for tourism, it's got to be for other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out there's a ton of reasons, because, you know, you get to launch and control communication satellites, because if you can figure out how to manufacture and ship in zero G, you would make a ton of money, because every meteorite that approaches Earth has like $1 trillion worth of platinum in it. And all of a sudden you see, like, oh, I see why these guys are doing this. It's not so they can like do a sightseeing tour of the lower atmosphere. It's so they can figure out how to monopolize the
Mm.
act of being in space and how to profit off that. And when I started thinking in those terms, it was like, oh yeah, like there's got to be plenty of ways to profit off time travel. I mean, and there are some ideas that come to mind like really easily in terms of, you know, go back and pick a couple of winning lotto ticket numbers or
Right.
something. But then you get into things like stock market manipulation and, you know, sort of trying to reinvent technologies, or there's so many ways to game the system. And billionaires, that's what they do. They game the system. They've
Mm.
figured out ways to sort of hoard wealth and hoard resources in a way that puts them on top of the pile. So yeah, there's a very healthy hatred in my heart that I'm writing from. But you're right. You're right in the sense that you don't want it to be heavy-handed, and that's always the difficult part, is because you don't want the reader to feel like they're being lectured. You know, you want them to
Yeah.
read it and get it and understand it, but not feel like they just walked out of a civics lesson, because that's
Right.
that's not fun. I think I kind of cut my teeth on that writing The Warehouse, which was,
Mm.
you know, a big anti-Amazon book, and so I spent so much of that book asking the question of, how do I talk about how terrible these business practices are in a way that is entertaining? You know, with Paradox, it's easy. You just throw a dinosaur in every now and again.
Right. Did either of you watch the movie Don't Look Up?
I heard
Yes.
dismal reviews about it. I
It
heard it was just
was
not good.
just fine. Like, it's not
Yeah,
great, but there
yeah.
is an element of what you're saying which was interesting, which was the most interesting part of the movie, was how they had an opportunity to destroy this meteor that was going to destroy the planet, and as they're like counting down to destroy it, a billionaire comes in and convinces the president to not do it because like they can make so much money off of like the natural resource that um the asteroid will have. And you're just watching it like, wow, people really, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is barely fiction. Like, this is barely fiction. So it's just
Yeah.
interesting. Like, it is a healthy hatred in our hearts, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's impossible to have become a billionaire without having done very, very terrible things.
Yeah.
Exploiting
Yeah.
workforces, destroying the planet. Like, you can't be a completely altruistic and guiltless billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
I just before we got on, I was reading in the New Yorker a review of Walter Isaacson's new biography on Elon Musk, and I'm like,
Hmm.
man, part of me wants to read this, and part of me
I
knows
know.
it's going to be a big time hate read.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is not good for my blood pressure, which I'm already on medication for.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. Something else that I loved about this book is just it has an extraordinary cast of characters, and they're all like so unique, and they're really paramount to January, but also to how certain plot points unfold. And I a lot of times when I'm liking a book, I'll like switch to the audio because I'm like dying to hear how the audiobook sounds. And the audiobook is so good for this book.
Really?
The person who does the reading just does an incredible job of capturing each character uniquely. So I'm curious, like, how did you keep this organized for you during the writing process? Do you have like each of their names on a post-it or like bullet points or something? Like, what did you do?
Well, just real quick, I'm so glad to hear you say that you liked the audiobook. That was Emily Wuzeller, who narrated Zinnia's character in The Warehouse, which I think she did Paxton too. I can't listen to my audiobooks because they
Sure.
mess with my head, because it's like, that's not how that sounds in my brain.
Sure.
This is weird. So whenever anyone says that it was really good, I'm like, thank God. Like I know she does a good job. That's why I asked for her
Of
back on
course.
this one. But
Yeah.
yeah, I got kind of lucky in the sense that part of the fun of writing a hotel is that you've got hotel staff,
Right.
so you have these characters, you can have a manager, you can have a concierge, you can have a sort of head bellhop, you can have these sort of archetypal like characters
Mhm.
working for you. And then it's a matter of figuring out, like, okay, like what do their functions need to be? And then when it was like, oh, I have to have a couple of billionaires coming in to bid on this thing. Like, how do I want to build out this cast list? And it was like, well, what would be interesting? Like, of course, we have to have a sort of social media giant billionaire, and we have to have a self-made billionaire, and we have to have an old racist real estate billionaire, and we have to have a Saudi prince, because that's where pretty much all the money in the world is concentrated. And yeah, I'm a vigorous outliner, so
Mm.
I'll come up with all my plot points and my character maps and descriptions of everyone, and really try to keep that balance of understanding what each one is supposed to be doing for the story, because each one is serving a different function, you know. And especially when you're writing a mystery, you want to have some red herrings, you want to have people
Mhm.
you suspect, you want to have people that can throw and cast suspicion. So from a mechanical standpoint, it's sort of like looking for all the right nuts and bolts that are going to fit into the machine, that are going to keep it moving smoothly. And then from the other perspective, it's like, how much fun do I want to have?
Totally.
Like who can I introduce, and how can I make them feel like characters that you can easily see them step off the page and go be the star of their own story? And when I think in those terms, it gets a lot more interesting for me.
Well, so you said that you are an outliner. How much do you stick to that outline as you go through the drafting process? Because I've heard so many stories of people who are like, I have this outline and I start and then it's gone.
Right.
I always know what the big points are. And I know, I always know the beginning. I always know the ending. I have to have the ending because I have to have an end point. But the way I describe it to people is it's like taking a road trip, an old school road trip with an actual paper map. And I know
Mm.
that, I'm starting in one city, I'm ending in another. And I see the route that I'm going to take that makes the most sense.
Yeah.
But I leave myself room that if I'm driving and I see a sign for like the world's biggest bowl of yarn, it's like, cool, I'm going to go check that out. And maybe it is stupid, and maybe it was a waste of time, or maybe it was the best bowl of yarn ever. So I try to allow myself those points of, okay, like I've got an idea, I'm going to follow it for a little bit, we're going to see how it goes. And I tend to find that I usually am fairly close to my outline, but definitely in the process, things kind of move around and shift and change a little bit, which I think is good. I think that if I was too rigid about it, then
Mm.
I wouldn't be able to have those moments of discovery. I
Hmm.
think that's the thing that scares people about writing outlines. They're like, well, what's the fun? You're not discovering
Yeah.
anything along the way. And it's like, well, I think it just keeps you on a path. So you're sort of working with intent instead of spiraling
Yeah.
off road. That was the thing that I did with my first book, is I didn't know how to write a book. So I just sat down and started writing. And after like 5 years, I had a mess of a draft. And a very cool author, who had no reason to do this. He was just being kind, offered to read it. And he read it and was like, you've got a lot of great stuff here, but you have to do a page one rewrite. And he was completely
Wow.
correct. And I found, at least for my process, that what I needed to do was sit down and actually break down what I thought the story needed to be, like do my first outline and then rewrite it. And then it really came together. So, I respect anyone who could write without an outline. I mean, Amy, when we were doing the panel at the Writers Digest conference, I think Hank Philippi Ryan said that she does an outline,
Mm.
and I'm like,
Hmm.
I want some of what you're drinking. Like, that sounds so much fun. And I love this idea of maybe one day actually sitting down and trying to write something without an outline and see what happens. But I just find, for me in my process, that's the thing that keeps me the most centered.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Sorry, you mentioned red herrings earlier. That I remember what I was gonna say,
Cool.
and I just wanted to say, like, yeah, they were working hard in your book because I really thought I knew. I really thought I knew who it
Really?
was. Like,
Okay.
and I just don't guess anything, and I never guess it right. Like, I am the perfect audience for this. And I was so proud of myself. I was like, it's this person. It's this person. Wow, look at me go. And then I just was so wrong. And is like one of the joys of these kinds of books is that when they're done like with this much attention to detail and accuracy, like you like, I relish being wrong. You know what I mean? Like I was like, oh, I was so wrong. Like, and it makes you want to go back and reread it and look for the clues. So yeah, it was just like, it really blew my mind. This book really blew my mind because I was just like, this is relentless. Like the pacing is nuts in a good way. I'm certain I know who it is, and then I was wrong.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's always really satisfying to hear that stuff too, because those are the things that you hope for when you're writing it. But also, that's also the thing that's so hard about writing a book, is that you have to dedicate months and months and months of time and just hope it works out. You hope it comes together. Again, you got to be stubborn. You got to be able to say
Totally.
like, yeah, no, this is going to be fine. Even though I spend most of the time that I'm writing a book being like, I don't know how to write a book. It doesn't matter how many I've written at this point. I still don't believe I know how to write a book. Like I'm starting the sequel to Assassins Anonymous, and so
Wow.
noodling around with the first chapter and trying to figure out the voice, and there is a very deep part of me right now that is like, I don't know how to do this. Like, why am I
Yeah.
doing this? And it's amazing. It's so someone said this to me, that it's like writing a book is like you climb a mountain, you get down to the other end of the mountain, you look at the next mountain, and you say, I have no idea how to climb a mountain. Like it's
Yeah.
like you do it in like a fugue state. It's like you got to kind of click in and lock in.
So you did mention Assassins Anonymous as the
Yes.
next thing you're working on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think you've got more than just that in the works, don't you? Don't you have something else coming out with a co-writer?
I do. That's actually, I finished edits on that yesterday, and
Nice.
that has now, so that's over to Alex Segura. He's my co-writer on that, and it's called Dark Space, and
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of we're doing our Star Trek, but it's basically if like John
Nice.
le Carré did Star Trek. So it's a lot of like space espionage, and
Oh,
it's a fun
nice.
one. That's coming out from Blackstone, I think, later in the year. In 2024, so I've got two next year, which is super
Wow.
exciting.
Busy year
And
for
plus,
you.
Alex is such a good friend, and we've worked on a lot of stuff together. So it'll be fun to work on promo for that one.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And you're already working on a sequel to
Yes.
Assassins Anonymous.
Yeah, I was very, very fortunate in that. So Assassins Anonymous was optioned for a film by
Oh
Amblin,
wow.
which was kind of a wild process because I don't think my film agent sent it to anyone. It got leaked by some book scouts and got passed around Hollywood, and all of a sudden her phone was ringing off the hook,
Wow.
and it kind of went viral in Hollywood. And then Steven Spielberg came in, and it was like, oh well, I guess this is the end to this conversation. We know who's getting it, and they absolutely loved it, and look, like it's an option. It doesn't mean anything is going to happen, but the way they envision it is as a franchise, and in my
Wow.
head, I can see very easily how it could become a series of books. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm digging into
Wow.
right now, which is really, really, really exciting.
Steven
Yeah.
Spielberg. We own him here. He's from Cincinnati, so all of us
Nice.
pretend he was our neighbor.
Yeah, and it wouldn't even be for him to direct. He would probably be like a
It doesn't
producer
matter.
on it. But yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. He's involved. Like, I don't care.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
like when they
Exactly.
told me like, oh, we talked to Steven about this story and he really loved it, and I was like, oh, did
He
he?
said
Like
my name.
I lost my cool. I lost
Yeah.
my cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's so neat. Have any of your other books been optioned for film?
Pretty much everything has been optioned at one point or
Wow.
another. The
Mm-hmm.
Warehouse, Ron Howard had that at Imagine Entertainment.
That's
Then the
cool.
option expired, but someone else is actually very close to optioning it.
Hmm.
Then my initial series of books, my Asher McKenna books, that I actually just read the pilot script for. Village Roadshow has that, and they're working on
Wow.
that.
Nice.
And the pilot is brilliant. It's completely unlike the books, and yet they went in such a weird direction with it, and I absolutely love it.
How cool.
So we're hoping for that to move forward. And then with Paradox, that's with working title, and again, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant pilot script. And I can't say who, but a couple of days before the
Yeah.
writer's strike, a really, really cool actress signed on to play
No
January.
way.
And now it's like, oh, I guess we will wait. So
Yeah.
I am
absolutely
very eagerly watching for the news to end, and then they'll go out, and it'll still be a process, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen. But it's I feel very fortunate to have projects active like this, and to see that people are taking the work and interpreting it in a really fun and exciting way. And now it's, once again, we got to wait for a whole bunch of rich dudes to come to the realization that they will live without a sixth yacht if it means that their writers can actually afford to pay for healthcare.
Yeah.
We call that the bare minimum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
It's wild. It's wild. I mean, it's the way things have been going for a long time. It's really frustrating to see. And I've got a whole nother book idea about hoarding wealth that I would
can't
like
wait
to
for
get
that
to
one.
at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sign me up. I will read that one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I had another question, but I think it's totally irrelevant to what we were actually talking about. So I'll
Well,
skip
now I'm curious,
that.
though.
Well, it was about what you said with the script and for the pilot for the warehouse, it being totally unlike the book. And I'm always so interested when, like, when do authors get to participate or choose to participate in adapting their books to TV or film? And when they aren't involved, how do you let go of that? I mean, I feel like I would be protective of what I wrote, and then other authors are like, oh, it's out there. It's for other people to work with now.
Yeah. There's a part of me that does feel protective of the things that I write. There's also a part of me that understands from a completely, rational perspective of like wanting to be able to send my daughter to a good college, that even if they make a bad TV show or a bad movie, it's going to sell books, and it's going to help my career, and it's going to be okay. Obviously, I want them to do a good job, but
Sure.
I've been very fortunate again in that, I read both the pilot scripts for Paradox and for New York. They sent them to me and they were like, "Do you have any notes?" And I was like, "Yes, I have a note. These are very good."
Oh, wow.
I didn't have to be in this position of like, "Oh, but you messed this. Oh, you should change." Like the people working on them were just phenomenal. So, had I gotten a script that I didn't feel great about, whether or not I could say like they always say like, "Oh yeah, we want your input," and then over the course of time you find out if that's true or not.
Right.
I've been really lucky in that everyone I've worked with so far has been incredible, and they've been very responsive. But I also understand my role in the process, which is not to tell them how to do their job, because I don't know how.
Totally.
I understand that sometimes I just have to sit in the corner and patiently fold my hands and wait, and I'm okay with that. I also have friends, authors, who are like, "Oh yeah, my book got options," and then they never spoke to me again. And then there was an announcement in the trades about someone getting casted, and I really wish they had told me about it. So it's one of those things where it's like, it depends on who you work with. So I have just had the real incredible luck to just, everyone I've worked with so far has just been super cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Rob, thank you so much. It was fantastic talking to you. I appreciate the book and look forward to what you're working on next.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Thank you for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Join us next month when we'll be talking about revision and self-editing. Until then, you can always find us at writersdigest.com or on social media at Writer's Digest. See you next time.